Today, of course, marks 18 years since the 9/11 attacks, and one of our next guests was at the center of the response. Condoleezza Rice was President Bush's national security advisor at the time, later, of course, became Secretary of State. She's now co-authored a new book with Philip Zelikow. It's called To Build a Better World, Choices to End the Cold War and Create a Global Commonwealth. And we say good morning to both of you.
Good morning.
We have to pause for 9/11.
Yes.
And, of course, this is an important day. And I just wonder what your personal memories are of this day. 18 years.
18 years. It's hard to believe. And my personal memory is standing in the White House, learning of the first plane, the second plane, the plane had hit the Pentagon, and recognizing that American security would never be the same. But today, I think we pause also to remember those who lost their lives, the families that were long affected, the first responders who came in that day at great risk to themselves, the men and women in uniform who would go and defend us, and especially I like to remember, too, the resilience of our country, the coming together around a sense that we were now deeply American, and I think we could use some of that.
Yeah, there
again.
was that feeling
Yes.
of shared grief,
Yes.
but also shared resolve. You, of course, were the director of the 9/11 Commission. Are you surprised? You know, in 18 years, knock on wood, happily, there hasn't been a massive mass casualty attack, like terror attack like that. Are you surprised?
Well, I am a little surprised there hasn't been more, but I've been impressed at the way a lot of Americans have responded. We haven't relied just on one defense. We've relied on layers of defenses from the hardened cockpit doors on outwards that people encountering at the airports, to our borders, to our partners overseas. A lot of people have worked very hard to make America safer, and it may not be perfectly safe, but it is safer.
Let's turn to some of the news headlines. Your book is called To Build a Better World, so we can talk about the world. And, of course, the big news this morning is the firing/resignation of John Bolton, a man you know and served with. What do you make of that? This is the third national security advisor now in the administration. Is that turnover a concern to you?
Well, of course, you'd like stability in these positions, but it's not uncharacteristic of other administrations, too, that you get some turnover. Look, a national security advisor may be the hardest job in government, trying to bring the government together on the same page for the president's priorities. And John Bolton is somebody of great intellect. He loves this country deeply. I think he did a really good job, and I think he's going to be missed because he was skeptical of some of the decisions that were being made, and that's always good. But it's always the case, too, that if the national security advisor and the president are not on the same page, it's not the president who's going to go. And so I think John understands that.
Well, you may or may not know the president tweeted about you just last night. He was watching an interview you did on Fox News. He called it excellent, very interesting and secure perspective on life, he said of you. Well, that, of course, got people thinking, would you want to be the national security advisor in this administration?
Oh, thank you. I've done that job. And I think I won't try to catch a lightning in a bottle again. No, he'll find someone who suits his style, and he'll find someone, I hope, who can bring the security team together, because you really have to have the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, National Security Advisor, Secretary of the Treasury pulling in the same direction.
Any reason to think you're being considered for that? No approach from the White House?
Certainly not.
Okay, we crossed that off the list.
Yeah.
Let me turn to you, Philip, on this issue that was apparently one of the issues of contention with John Bolton, the national security advisor. This is this meeting that was to take place with the Taliban at Camp David just for this last weekend. It was, of course, canceled by the president, but also planned by the president. What do you think of that in terms of not only just the optics of meeting at Camp David, but the deal that apparently was on the table and very close to being done?
I'm glad the meeting was canceled.
Why?
I don't think the Taliban should have been invited to Camp David. I don't think actually we should be negotiating an agreement with the Taliban to determine how many troops we need in Afghanistan. Excluding the Afghan government that we've been fighting to defend for 18 years. Here's the situation. If we want to draw down some more in Afghanistan for our reasons, working with our partners, okay, draw down. But don't try to paper it over with a deal with the Taliban that's trying to kill civilians day and night every day.
Well, that raises a question. I mean, are you concerned that the president apparently was open to such a deal?
Well, some people believe that this is the way to end wars. You have peace negotiations. I don't mind if you want to have negotiations, but Philip is right. Nothing about this seemed to be going in the right direction. When the Taliban said that the Afghan government was a puppet, illegitimate government, they wouldn't respect the Constitution. Just imagine what that would mean, for instance, to the women of Afghanistan who have trusted us to come out of their shells, to put their girls in school, to join the military. We owe something to the people of Afghanistan, and we should never forget, as we have the anniversary of 9/11, that this started in Afghanistan, and we cannot allow Afghanistan to become a terrorist safe haven again. There is nothing to suggest that the Taliban would prevent that from happening. In fact, they are terrorists, and they're most likely to encourage it.
You write a lot about Russia in your book. You obviously are a Russia scholar. You know Putin. What do you think Putin thinks of President Trump?
Well, I don't know that Vladimir Putin has any thoughts about anybody except the following. I need to find a way to dominate. I need to find a way to humiliate. That's just who he is. He has decided that Russia needs an enemy, and it's the United States. And it's part of his domestic strategy also to hold his country together at a time when the economy is suffering, when people are starting to get a little tired of his leadership. So whatever he thinks of the American president, he thinks that the United States of America is a good target for his animus, and we're going to continue to see that. I will say this, we're going to have to find a workable relationship with the Russians, even under Vladimir Putin. But I believe we have put him in a difficult situation with the sanctions that have been placed upon Russia. And he's just, as I said, he needs an enemy, and it's us.
Do you think either of you think that Russia's been adequately punished for its interference and meddling in the election?
The time actually for punishing Russia for interference in the election has now come and gone. We've done what we've done, and it's...
Is that a no?
It's basically no use crying over stuff maybe we should have done 2 years ago. The focus now needs to be on how we protect the election next time.
Right. Because I will completely second that. Look, the first time that they interfered in our election, it was shame on them. If they do it again, it's shame on us. We know a lot about what they've done. If we aren't taking steps to prevent that, then that's a problem that we are creating.
When you look at the 2016 election and you look at it, how, relatively speaking, it was decided by a handful of votes in a few states, do you think it's possible that Russia's election interference actually worked? It actually elected Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton?
I don't think there's any evidence of that. And, you know, I really don't think that that's a good conversation to have. I think that really does devalue the people in Wisconsin and Michigan and others who decided to vote for President Trump. But whether you like this president or not, whether you believe that he should have been president or not, let's give the credit to the Americans who went out and voted for somebody who they thought would bring change. And the question is, are we going to be responsive to some of the messages that were out there? And do you hear me now? People who felt that they were disadvantaged by globalization, the unemployed coal miner in West Virginia, the opioid addicted person in Pennsylvania. Are we going to be responsive to those people? That's really the question we should be asking.
Well, the book, of course, is called To Build a Better World. It's got a lot of thought-provoking issues in it. Thank you so much for being here this morning, especially on This Morning. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.